Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Lustig. I'm the director of the Center for Business Law here at New England Law Boston. I'm also the director of our Compliance and Risk Management certificate program. So on behalf of the center, I'd like to welcome you to this program. This is our concluding Zoom presentation for the year. This presentation is Compliance in the Waning Days of Pandemic, Reflections and Looking Forward. So a little bit of a disclaimer, I am not declaring that the pandemic is over, or maybe even in the waning days, it's just wishful thinking. I just needed something positive to sort of, help things along. So waning days sounded as good as I could make it. So just a little bit about the Center for Business Law and our programming. We're a group of 12 faculty members, and like our other two centers at the school, we provide basically a platform and forum for teachers working with students. We work on a variety of different projects, including preparing volunteer income tax preparation for developing summer fellow opportunities, working with this business and IP clinic, and most importantly, programs like this. Our first program of the year was sponsored by and hosted by Professor Wilton Hyman. It was on the impacts of the Great Recession and COVID-19 economic crisis on poor, majority, and marginalized communities. It was a great presentation with some great guests. I have put a link in our chat box for the YouTube on that. We also have we had to reschedule our session on corporate social responsibility with Professor Natasha Variani. Look for that in the fall. So with today's session, we come back to compliance, and we are fortunate to have some great guests, and I'm going to let Professor Abely introduce them, but let me introduce Professor Abely, who we're also very fortunate to have. She has joined our faculty this year. Professor Abely is a graduate of Dartmouth College and University of Virginia School of Law. Her practice background included work in compliance, and she taught our compliance course last fall. So with that, let me turn it over to Professor Abely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here today. We have two wonderful guests. We're so lucky to have two panelists here today. We have Rochelle Levy, who is Chief Compliance Officer, Investment Management North America at BNY Mellon. She is a New England Law Boston alum as well. We also have Jim Bryant. He teaches hospital law here. He's VP and Chief Compliance Officer at Brigham Health. So we are so lucky to have these two senior experienced compliance personnel here to speak to us about recent trends in the compliance world and give us a picture of what's been going on during the pandemic and beyond.
Hey, Christine, I forgot to put one thing in. If you have questions out there in the audience, and again, thank you for showing up, please put your questions in the chat, and we're going to go through for 15 or 20 minutes with questions from Professor Abely to our panelists, and then we'll give the questions from the audience after that point. So please put whatever questions you have. They could be a follow-up. They could be not related to questions that are being posed. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. So we will get started with some of the questions. So first, my question for each of you is to ask you each how you each got into compliance.
Flip a coin.
Yeah, hey, Rochelle, why don't you go ahead and I'll follow up.
Sure. So I always wanted to do compliance, loved tax and administrative law. I knew by my second year that's what I wanted to do, but the path to getting into compliance used to be different. So the original plan was to be a prosecutor, get that knowledge and skill set, and then move over onto the private sector side. I graduated during the last recession, so that didn't work out. federal prosecutors, they were no longer hiring. Even the local DA was no longer hiring. So instead, I went and did criminal defense and got experience specifically in white collar crime and setting up SEC compliance programs, and then used that to get into compliance and finance.
So unlike Michelle, I hadn't thought about going into compliance early in my career. I started out in a private law firm doing litigation, and then went to go work in the state attorney general's office doing white collar crime. And we were in particular focused on kind of the work I was doing was focused on kind of healthcare related criminal activity, and we had a couple of kind of insurance fraud type cases, and I was there for about 5 years. And by one of the cases that I had prosecuted, the defense counsel happened to be on the Board of Registration in Medicine, and he said, you know, we need a director of enforcement there. You are you, if you ever think about leaving the AG's office, why don't you come there? So I did go to the Board of Registration Medicine for a couple of years and learned about physician misconduct, and also part of that was the data integrity and the kind of event reporting and safety environment of the hospitals. And from there, I went to work for Medicare. I was the Associate Regional Administrator for Medicare in Boston, and focused on kind of fraud and abuse efforts. I was cross-designated as a special U.S. attorney, and then also did some work while at Medicare on fraud and abuse, contractors, and on Stark regulations. And the major focus of the work I was doing at Medicare was really looking at what made what work that was being done by providers, particularly hospitals, that enhanced the program and really protected the program, because I had come to the conclusion that most of the well, not most, but an awful lot of the work in protecting the money for the Medicare program was the result of self-enforcement by hospitals and other providers that were trying to do the right thing and comply with regulations. And so through those efforts, I'd had a lot of contact with defense counsel representing providers, and it just turned out that a position opened up at one of the hospitals that one of the counsel I worked with regularly represented, and I became the first chief compliance officer at the Brigham, and have been there for a number of years. Yeah, it was kind of a tortured path to get there, but I think all my background helped in my current position.
Thank you so much. So speaking of current positions, my next question for you both is, can you each tell us what your day currently looks like? What does a typical day look like in your job?
You want to go first this time?
Sure, we can take turns. You know, it's funny. Before we started, they asked me if I was working from home today, and I am. So these days, a typical day is oftentimes at home, in ways that it never was before the pandemic. I spend a lot of time. One of the things that I like about compliance, particularly in maybe not particularly, but in the healthcare arena, is that it's a little bit like being a legal generalist, or in the general counsel's office. You're getting thrown into a lot of different things, a lot of operational issues, and trying to advise them as best you can over the course of the day. So I spend a lot of time in meetings, mostly focused on kind of new initiatives or operational initiatives of the hospital, trying to provide guidance to them on those issues as they develop, and trying to get ahead of the curve in terms of the legal and regulatory environment that they're likely to face when they're doing those new initiatives.
Great. My industry and my work is a lot more global. So my day starts very early, usually to talk with my colleagues in Hong Kong. But because we're so used to doing video conference and all, working from home hasn't been as different. You know, we've never met in person, so it doesn't make a big difference now. But similar to what Jim was saying, it's a lot of meetings, a lot of advisory work. But I do have I enjoy getting we call them fire drills, just random things happen that you got to take care of right then and there that day. And I like having that peppered in throughout, breaks up the meetings. And then also a nice amount of document review. I am not a document drafter. Don't ask me to draft a contract. I will mess it up. But really enjoy looking at things with the lawyers and saying, yes, that's technically correct. But someone just out of undergrad who's reading this policy will have no idea what you're asking them to do. So let's make it something that the layperson can understand. So a nice mix. And then usually, because most of my work is in the morning, done at a reasonable hour in the evening.
So we also wanted to speak to you both about the pandemic and how compliance has changed and what trends you've seen emerging in your organization or the greater industry during the pandemic, and whether you foresee those trends being temporary, being more long lasting, and how your priorities have shifted in response.
You want me to start off, Rochelle, or well, I'll go first. So I think one of the interesting aspects of dealing with the pandemic over the last year has been trying to provide the best guidance I can to the hospital to keep compliant with regulations and law, and try and manage that ever-changing environment as best we can. But at the same time, given the field that I'm in, which is healthcare, the pandemic has put amazing stressors on our facility, on our physicians, on the care we give, on our care modalities. And the balancing act has been to really try and advise the hospital as best I can with the regulations and not get in the way of necessary innovations and changes, and just moving as trying to help facilitate the practice of medicine in ways that we never envisioned that we would have to do. And it's a little bit uncomfortable sometimes, because there's the rules as they developed for healthcare during the pandemic were not always clear. They were rapidly changing, they were evolving, and yet the pressing need to treat the patients and to deal with the crisis of the pandemic was unstoppable. And so trying to balance those over the last year was really a very challenging aspect of being in compliance, but in some ways quite rewarding, because you always kind of kept the big picture of, we're here for the patients, we're here to provide the best care we can. We'll provide the guidance we can with the regulations as best we can, but it really, you have to keep uppermost in your mind what is best for our patients in a crisis. So that was a fairly unique situation. I think that in terms of the trends that we saw, there was an awful lot of bending of the regulatory environment through government issued waivers of regulations and regulatory leniency that was provided to us, that allowed us to provide care in different ways, particularly telemedicine, virtual health, allowed us to move out to provide services in different locations than we were typically allowed to do, allowed us to kind of focus on critical aspects of care without all of the paperwork that we'd in the past have to do, because paperwork in a hospital environment during a pandemic is a infectious disease problem. And so we were avoiding paperwork, which is an anathema to the healthcare regulatory environment generally. So a lot of change that happened. Many of those changes, I think, are going to be lasting to varying degrees. Telehealth, when we started the pandemic, telehealth, we probably had in the 3 figures of telehealth visits annually, and in the last year we were in the 5 figures of telehealth visits annually. And the patients have grown accustomed to that, the physicians have grown accustomed to that, and the payers have grown accustomed to that. And so I think that some form of telehealth and virtual visits are here to stay for sure. It's probably a little less clear how that will be. I think that I'm working from home today. Remote work is at various points we had probably 30 or 40% of our workforce and a large percentage of our administrative force working remotely at least some of the time. I think that trend is here to stay too, and that raises a lot of kind of quasi-compliance issues in terms of making sure that our infrastructure, IT infrastructure, is secure and can enable that kind of work, making sure that privacy considerations are uppermost. Labor law issues arise when you're working remotely in terms of making sure that our employees have their adequate lunch breaks and they're not working longer hours without overtime and things like that. That becomes challenging. And then just the interactions with people and how we ensure a compliance environment in a hospital when we're working remotely is a challenge in itself. So I think those two things will definitely carry forward going post-pandemic.
All right, I guess I have to preface mine by saying these are my personal opinions. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Bank of New York Mellon, and I'm not able to discuss a lot of material non-public information. So with that out of the way, usually for me at my job, I get to say, we're not brain surgeons. No one is going to die based on what we do in the finance industry. And so from that perspective, Jim, kudos to you and being able to really work through this pandemic, and thank you for everything that you're able to do. The issues in the finance industry are nothing compared to what's been going on in the healthcare industry. That being said, it's also interesting to compare the two industries because in finance, there are a lot of regulatory requirements that we have business continuity and that we're able to continue servicing our clients no matter what happens. And so for the majority of financial firms, I think this was just an extended test. So normally you would do a work from home test, send the whole team home or to their alternate location for a few days or weeks or a month. And this just went longer than I think most had originally planned for. So in that instance, COVID didn't affect finance as much because we were already required to have these plans in place and we were able to enact them properly. But some of the things that have changed are how do you do your daily, your corporate investigations without being able to be in the room with someone? How do you do your due diligence of third-party vendors? Make sure they're not a shell company if you can't actually go show up at their warehouse and see whether there are workers and machines actually there. So it's been more of, I guess, an intellectual challenge than what Jim has had to do in the healthcare industry. As far as working conditions, I think working from home is here to stay at least part of the time. And since everything we were able to do adapted very well, I don't see a problem with that going forward.
Thank you both. Rochelle, I have a question for you in particular. So we wanted to ask you a bit about ESG and how trends in ESG, have they affected your compliance work and how have they?
So for those who don't know, ESG are financial instruments, and ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And what that means can mean many different things. The SEC actually just published a new risk alert April 9th on ESG. And for me, it's more of a very interesting piece of administrative law. So if you love administrative law, this is your thing. To give you an example, So in October, the Trump administration, so I deal a lot with retirement accounts, basically came out through the Department of Labor, which governs retirement accounts, not necessarily the SEC, which is another weird wrinkle, and said, we, the Department of Labor, think that decisions made in retirement accounts should only be based on pecuniary factors. You're not allowed to consider anything else. And this was released in October, just before the election, and it had an enactment date of 90 days later. So I think it ended up being like June 2nd or January 2nd or something like that. Then with the Biden administration coming in, they said, whoa, we're going to put on holds. We're going to review all of the recent rules from the past administration, which is normal. But because of the tension between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, that basically meant that you had to race towards a 90-day finish line to make sure that your compliance program is where you want it to be. And then you have to wait and see. And from there, the Department of Labor, who our new labor secretary is Marty Walsh, he stepped in and said, I'm going to look at this again to see if this is really something that we want to do. Meanwhile, you have the SEC on the other side sending out risk alerts and saying they're going to start examinations looking at this security type. And so from an administrative law perspective, it's very interesting to see the two different administrative bodies, the handoff of that transition, and then all of this is going on during a pandemic, which I think we can all agree is more important than necessarily what type of security you should have in a 401k.
Thank you so much. Jim, I have another question for you. I know that you spoke a bit about telemedicine and the challenges around that, but I was wondering if you could walk us more through the details about how that changed during the pandemic, how you reacted to that, and some more about those particular challenges.
Sure. I had mentioned that telemedicine was not a vibrant program for any of the payers, including the Medicare and the federal Medicare program prior to the pandemic. It was fairly restricted. It was restricted into who could receive telemedicine services. They typically were individuals who were in remote locations or rural locations that didn't have ready access to care. It was restricted to the types of people who could provide services, only physicians, and the circumstances that they could provide services. And the reimbursement was actually quite limited as well. With the advent of the pandemic, telemedicine very quickly became the preferred way to treat people who didn't need hospitalization, to keep them out of the hospitals, to free up space for people who were suffering from acute distress or COVID, and further to protect the physicians who might be exposed to a lot of the disease as well. So it really became a very, very preferred method of treating patients for a period of time. This is in about March or so. At that time, the federal government issued a bunch of waivers of program restrictions that were to last through the course of the pandemic. So they are typically not permanent changes to the telemedicine rules. But through the course of the pandemic, which is still going on now, the government allowed for the use of telemedicine by any number of providers, not only physicians, but physician assistants, therapists, and the like. It eliminated the restrictions on the provider being in a designated hospital location. It eliminated the restrictions on the patient being at a rural location. So it could be done even if a patient for instance, if the patient was in the hospital, but the physician was, for safety reasons, outside of the room or at their home so that they're not being exposed. telemedicine could be used in those locations. So dramatic changes to the use and utilization of telemedicine. Along with that, there was a recognition that because of the truly disastrous financial consequences of the pandemic to healthcare providers, there's a recognition that these services needed to be paid in ways that they never were before. And so telemedicine was, through state directive and through waiver programs of the Medicare program, paid as a clinical service would be if it were done face-to-face. And that included facility fees. So for people who are unaware, there are two components of a doctor's visit with a patient. It could be the physician's time and effort and services, but it also encompasses the utilization of the hospital's location and facilities as well. So that's called the technical component. And the rules typically allowed for the reimbursement of by both the physician and the hospital for services that otherwise would have been paid were they not done by telemedicine. So a huge change in that regard as well. The number of services that were allowed to be paid for telemedicine were pretty significantly changed and enhanced. And so there, there was, it became a preferred way to provide care, as I said. What was significant about it is that the rules, as I said, started coming out in March, but the pandemic preceded that to a certain degree, and they continued, obviously, until the current day, but the rules kept coming out, and yet physicians were being encouraged to see people through telemedicine modalities. And so we were, in some cases, kind of winging it. I hate to say that as a compliance officer, but you were trying to interpret the rules. You were trying to figure out the best way to provide those services. Things like in the past, the security of the IT system that you're using to provide those telemedicine services had to be quite secure, and HIPAA compliant. And so in I think it was April, the Office of Civil Rights came out and said, you're allowed to use modalities that would not be necessarily HIPAA compliant. Things like, your iPhone that have synchronous audio and visual, or Zoom like we're using now, and other modalities like that would not necessarily be HIPAA compliant. They were going to relieve people of the concern that they would enforce HIPAA protections for those types of services. But that came out after the fact that we were already doing telemedicine services. So there was a lot of anxiety about what we were doing and whether we could do it and the like. But eventually, we were given a lot of discretion to provide these kinds of services. It's been a godsend, I think, to patients and to us. I think that we were also given a lot of latitude in terms of licensure of physicians, which is a really significant issue that we're going to have to deal with post-pandemic. The federal government allowed for the provision of services for telemedicine out of state. Which may not sound like much, but the provision of telemedicine services is governed by state law as well as federal reimbursement law. But under state law, if you are doing telemedicine in another state, if the patient sits in New Hampshire, for instance, and you're in a Boston hospital, you are practicing medicine in New Hampshire and therefore subject to New Hampshire licensure and Board of Registration regulations. And so one of the things that they did in the pandemic was allow for the provision of out-of-state services. So that was a big deal as well. All of these things are great, but they are, for the most part, are only in place through the period of the pandemic. And so what we're really going to have to do is figure out how to unwind, or what we have to unwind post-pandemic. The licensure issue, I think, will not go away. We'll have to figure out whether or not we can provide care across state lines, and what the licensure requirements of the physician providing that will be. I think that it's almost a sure thing that the reimbursement for telemedicine will go down post-pandemic. Um, uh, it it has always, the reason why it wasn't well utilized before was because most payers saw it as not particularly effective, and more importantly, not resource intensive. And so they didn't want to pay that much for it. If it becomes the preferred way of seeing patients, it will have a definite impact on the hospitals or physicians' bottom line, because we think that the payers will pay us less for telemedicine than they would if we were doing face-to-face visits. So that's something we're going to have to think about as well. And the requirements for telemedicine that were waived, such as originating site for where the patient sits and where the physician sits, and whether or not we can do, for instance, hospitals have so-called teaching encounters, where we have residents who are working with patients and the physicians overseeing them. During the pandemic, people could be in 3 or 4 different locations as part of an encounter. We could have a resident and a fellow sitting in their house, a physician sitting in his house, and the patient sitting in his or her house. And all of that would be considered to be an appropriate synchronous telemedicine visit. It's unclear whether that will be allowed going forward too. So just trying to figure out how it will be unwound and what will be difficult. And then on top of that, we'll have to figure out, it was an intensive training effort for our physicians to teach them how to do telemedicine and bill for telemedicine and document telemedicine. Once we unwind it, we've already had a period of a year now where people have been doing telemedicine. We're going to have to go back to them and tell them a different way of doing it, and that's not easy to kind of do that kind of outreach. So the training aspect of figuring out what the rules are going to be and how we get everyone on board with appropriate documentation and training and procedures will be significant. And then we also have the 2 governmental entities that I worry a lot about. So I mentioned the Office of Civil Rights oversees the security of the IT systems we use. I think they will weigh back in on what we can do for telemedicine once the pandemic is over. We worry about that. And then the government, while they have been fantastic about allowing us to do telemedicine, at the same time, the Office of the Inspector General, which is the significant oversight body for healthcare regulations, has already put in their work plan 7 audits focused strictly on telemedicine. So we know they're going to, at some point post-pandemic, they're going to do intense scrutiny of the billing of telemedicine and whether we met the requirements. So while the pandemic has been a sort of reprieve from the government audit activity, it's going to be short-lived.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it over to Professor Lustig to discuss some of the Q&A.
Great, thanks so much. This has been just terrific. So I've got a sort of a patchwork of questions that come. So let me, there's a couple of questions that really have to do with advising students who are interested in compliance. I think that'll be good to sort of mix things up. And then I've got a specific question for Rochelle and a specific question for Jim. So at some point, could the panelists, this is the point, address what advice they would give to a first-year student who is considering a career in compliance area? Is there general advice that you'd give, or is it more field specific? And actually, let me throw the other one in too, because you might want to combine your answers. So the second question from a different person is, for a soon-to-be graduate who is interested in compliance but not sure which particular industry, what's the best way to gain experience or insight in order to move forward, to know which industry to work in? So kind of how would you I mean, they're asking similar questions. How would you start, and how would you sort of pick an area to jump in?
Sure. Jim, if you don't mind, I'll go first and then. Okay, I'll take that as a yes.
Please do. Yes.
Okay. So as far as a 1L student, compliance to me is a skill. It's not industry specific. It's about how do you set up policies and procedures so that people will understand what their obligations are, because they can't read the law like you can. They don't have the law degree. And that it's about how do you test your policies and procedures? How do you test your controls? A control, it's a key point in your process that will prevent breach of the regulation. So whether that's having a supervisor review someone else's work, making sure that you have a lot of processes automated so that you exclude human error completely from the equation, that's a control. So it's really taking these concepts and being able to utilize that in any industry and against any regulatory framework. So the way that you can evidence that you have these skills is really looking at, again, your policy and procedure drafting. So what have you drafted, your appellate briefs, your motions? Is there anything that you've done to distill those down for a layperson? You know, if you have a law review journal or journal article, that's great sort of experience for this. But I would say because it's not field specific, and especially for a 1L, you don't know yet what pieces of law you're really going to love. I went to New England Law Boston because I wanted to do tons of human rights law, refugee law. This was the place to be for international law, for things like that. Had no idea until I took Professor Lustig's personal income tax class that tax was fascinating to me. Did not expect that to happen. So, you know, try a variety of classes and things that you wouldn't necessarily think of, because you don't know what's going to grab you. And these skills that you can learn through business law, through compliance, through corporate counsel classes, you're going to be able to apply in any context. So for that person that's graduating now, I would say don't limit yourself by location. Now, because of COVID-19, remote work is here to stay. So look wherever there are jobs, and don't limit yourself to an industry. You know, for me, I was thinking about manufacturing compliance and going through and making sure that, you know, Pakistani factory workers had livable working conditions. That's a type of compliance. But so is finance or healthcare. And so long as you have those basic skills and you're able to show how you can use those skills and adapt, I think you'll find many industries open to you.
Great. I would say that, and I think this builds a little bit on what Rochelle was saying, that compliance as an industry is not a monolith. And I think it's important to kind of understand that there are multifactorial ways to kind of approach compliance or get involved in compliance. I can speak to healthcare, for instance, where compliance is a huge umbrella. It covers privacy law, IT security law. We have clinical trials. We have conflicts of interest for our staff and their relationships with outside industry. We have billing compliance. We have clinical compliance and risk, which is really highly clinical, as the term indicates. We have environmental laws. The hospital, for instance, is one of the largest environmental polluter, disposers of waste in the state. So there's no, it would be a misnomer to say I want to do healthcare compliance without having an understanding that it could be, that there are different factors that you can look into. And I think that helps you when you're approaching it, to kind of have a sense that, try and get a sense of which of those fields you're really interested in, and try and explore pursuing that aspect of compliance. It's not just a compliance job. You might want to do, I want to do HIPAA compliance is a really hot topic. And with that being said, I would say my major advice to folks who are 1Ls is to don't be afraid to pick up the phone and call people or send emails to people. I love it when I get calls from people and they just want to know what my life is like or what I'm doing. I think most people do. And if they don't want to talk about it, they won't. But most people are really anxious to kind of share what they've learned or what their path has been. And I think it's really incumbent upon you to kind of, reach out to people, figure out what they are doing and what part of their work gets you jazzed and what aspect of the work makes you really excited about it and what you don't want to do. And I think that the cascading benefit of that, being willing to pick up the phone and talk to people that way, is that I can't tell you how many times people have called me and I've said, well, I don't have a position for you, but you should talk to this other person I know at this other hospital, or you should talk to this other person in this other unit, because you want to help people. So, and I think most people are kind of anxious to do that. So if you're just trying to explore whether you like compliance, talk to some compliance people, find out what their life is like and what they're doing and what they like and what they dislike, and see how that measures up with what your career goals are.
Yeah.
Found great
Yeah, go ahead.
advice. I was going to say great advice. People do that from the school all the time with LinkedIn messages. Jim is right, especially as a 1L or a 2L, reach out to people and just ask. We all
Yeah.
want to help.
We can help line people up with informational meetings and things like that, but that's great advice. I would add that within our curriculum, we've got some courses to consider. The one is the one Professor Abely teaches on corporate compliance, which is really a basic compliance course. And we have hospital law, which Jim has taught and I hope will teach, which there's a fair amount of compliance in that, right? And we have a course in healthcare law. We have a course in privacy law. We have human rights, business and human rights compliance. Professor LaPlante teaches. Some of the things Rochelle was mentioning fit nicely into that, if that's your interest. And then we have financial sector compliance, which is a really rock solid compliance course. So that plus we often have placements within the business and IP clinic that are focused on compliance. So, come talk to me, reach out to some of these folks. There's ways to gain some background. Great, thanks. So I guess it's up to me for the next question. Okay. So one of the questions by email was how do you have any tips? And this I think would go to each of you. This is one of our evening students who works in compliance during the day, and she asks, do you have any tips for multi-state employers trying to navigate the complexities of ensuring compliance with a patchwork of state-specific COVID regulations, along with basically along with all the other compliance areas you'd have to do before COVID? So any tips? And I think Jim has talked a little bit about some of the multi-state from the regulation of practice, but and it may be that this is outside, but any ideas about the best way to try to organize this? Because I think it's an organizational mess when you have to deal with the multi-employer thing.
Do you want me to go, Rochelle?
I can give the simpler answer because I deal with multi-state all the time, but it's probably different in a healthcare setting if you want to take it.
Yeah, it probably is. I mean, I'm part of a hospital system that's located in Massachusetts, so we're not a national corporation in that sense. I would say that the modality, the telemedicine, virtual visit modalities we talked about, there's a lot of out-of-state concerns for that. We are starting to get a handle on employment issues related to people who are working remotely. We were finding that people were, in the past, if you didn't want to work in the hospital, we didn't want you. And now there's a sense, well, we can hire really good people and they can live out in California and not be and still provide the same level of service as someone who's in Worcester doing the same service. And so employment and people have started to kind of during the pandemic, a lot of people have kind of said, I'm going to go, to the Caribbean for a month and I can still do my job and work remotely. We're just beginning to get a handle on that in terms of what the requirements are for our staff. For instance, California, as I understand it, has incredibly strict rules about working there and being considered an employee in the state of California in terms of workers' comp regulations and the like. And so one of the things what we're doing is we're assessing where our employees are. We're doing some data analysis of that. Most of them are in the New England area. So we have a rather limited set of laws to analyze to determine, what our employees can do in those locations and what are the tax implications. One of the main things that we're doing is considering we have I'm part of a hospital that is part of the Mass General Brigham system. So I have other sister hospitals that are in our system, but there's a corporate entity that oversees us. And one of the things we're thinking about is whether or not we have staff who are remote or out of state need to be employed by that parent corporation instead of the hospital itself, because then we can achieve some economies of scale in terms of figuring out the tax implications of working remotely and things like that, instead of every hospital doing that. So we are considering whether or not we centralize some of the HR work and the employment relationship. So that's one thing we're doing.
Yeah, see, that's really interesting to me because it's at a smaller scale. Financial institutions are already operating globally and have already had to deal with all of those sorts of issues. When you have people in multiple states, and in terms of compliance, so even just securities law, you have different laws in all 50 states, plus a federal overlay. Canada has the same. Whatever we're doing in the United States also has to adhere to Hong Kong law or the UK Proceeds of Crime Act. So we are very used to that complexity of laying out all of the requirements, which maybe on a smaller scale you can do in Excel, and finding a compliance program. I like to do them by least common denominator. So put the harshest consequences across the board and adhere to those. But sometimes that's not commercially viable. So you have to look at what's allowable in one area, but making sure that someone in another jurisdiction doesn't do it that way because it's not allowed in their jurisdiction. So the data analytics become very important, and people who have VBA skills, basic programming skills, Python, who can write out some of the data analytics and use Excel that way. Very useful if you can combine that with legal analysis. But also you can purchase systems called GRCs, governance, risk, and compliance systems, that will allow you to handle the huge complexity of these multi-jurisdictional questions. They're also able to then, oh gosh, you can sit there and think, well, how do you categorize all of your legal obligations? You've got HR obligations, tax obligations, your, let's say, software licensing, business continuity, cybersecurity, and then you get into the heart of the regulations for your specific industry. So those programs, kind of like e-discovery for large law firms, are becoming more and more necessary in order to keep track of all of these different regulations.
Great. Thanks. So let me switch to, we've got some panelist specific questions. So let's start with from Rochelle. One attendee asks, and maybe you can't talk about this, but the question is, can you talk about or give some information on the implementation of the Department of Labor fiduciary rule at BNY? Kind of know a little bit about that, but not enough.
So I can't talk about it specifically at BNY Mellon, but I can give the overall, what is the DOL fiduciary rule? And it's basically what I was talking about with ESG and the administrative law mix-up, but spread out over maybe 6 years. So it goes back to ERISA, the Employees Retirement Investment Savings Act, which is an act from 1974. very, very few updates. So if anything is outdated, you talk about technology, and Jim's talking about being able to use iPhones as HIPAA compliant. I mean, ERISA is a dinosaur. And so over the years, they've cobbled together a 5-part test on when the advice that you're giving to a Department of Labor regulated entity is fiduciary advice. The Department of Labor then, probably 5 years ago, maybe 6, put out a fiduciary rule and said, we're getting rid of the common law test. Here's an actual rule. And it was overturned on appeal. So interesting uh, set of administrative law principles going into the court system being overturned there. The SEC at the same time started considering its own fiduciary rule and how they would roll that out. And of course, it didn't quite match with the Department of Labor rule, which was overturned. So everybody's you're in limbo, and it's a lot of considering the risk and what is the true heart of the matter, and following all of these different developments and making sure that your compliance program is adaptable and complies with it at every step of the way. So if you've got a policy, you better make sure everyone who knows about the policy knows when you've changed it to match new laws. Then on top of all of that, which happened, summing up about 4 years ago, now you have the Department of Labor came out with another fiduciary rule that really codified that 5-part test that was in common law anyway. So in terms of being a 1L and knowing what classes to take, definitely take administrative law. You're going to want to know about comment periods and how long you've got to make your position known, and how long you've got to comply once it hits the Federal Register. And then it's really on compliance officers to make sure you stay educated, you stay aware. There's never an ability to check out and think that you know your subject perfectly. You really got to stay plugged in, because this stuff changes and it can change quickly.
Great. For Jim, there are a couple I'm going to try to consolidate here. Let's see how I do. So the first part is, how has practicing with hospital law changed your perspective on, and maybe it's how has it affected your perspective on hospitals and the medical system in general? How has this perspective aided your legal strategies and how you approach cases? The follow-up question is, what kind of lessons have you learned during the pandemic in terms of the strength and effectiveness of a hospital compliance program? And based on that, what would your recommendations to a healthcare compliance manager seeking to strengthen their compliance program be? I'm not sure if those can be put together or not after I just tried to put them together.
Well, it was a valiant effort.
Valiant effort, yeah.
Yeah.
That's the story of my life.
Yeah. I'll start with the second one, and then you can kind of nudge me or remind me about the first one again. But the second one, in terms of the compliance program and the pandemic and working in the hospital, I'll start with a kind of non-compliance answer and try and work my way back into it. But I consider myself incredibly fortunate to have had the opportunity to work in a setting like a hospital, particularly one like the one I work in during the pandemic, where I just saw absolutely selfless and amazing work that was being done by physicians and staff throughout, all with an eye towards trying to preserve public health and the health of their patients at a time when notwithstanding the fact that we talked about some of the waivers that were put out by the government and some of the kind of laxity that was allowed to but essentially the hospitals were taking a tremendous bath financially. They just patient censuses were down. We canceled elective surgeries, which is our lifeblood, financially, but we canceled elective surgeries so that we were prepared and able to prepare for patients who had COVID. We had people who were working on the clinical trials for the vaccines that are now being used. We had people working on clinical trials for remdesivir and how that could be used. I mean, they were doing truly remarkable work. And I think that it gives you an appreciation that I think one of the important things for me was that as I consider the compliance program important, critical to the operations of the hospital, critical to the culture and environment of the hospital, but it gives you a grounding that why you're doing this. You know, you're trying to ensure the integrity of the hospital, so at the viability of the hospital, and provide the best guidance you can so they can do these remarkable things. And so I would say that my appreciation of what the hospital did during the course of the pandemic has allowed me to kind of step back and see just where a compliance program fits in, which is we are there to ensure compliance with regulations, but we're really there to enhance ultimately patient care, which is, you know, it's a great feeling to be in a job that you feel has that benefit. The other aspect of working in a hospital during the pandemic was that I saw firsthand how significant public health concerns were to the hospital. They weren't just treating their patients, but they were really worried about the health of the public generally. And in particular, the diversity of care that was being given to different subgroups and different people throughout the city and throughout the region. And I think the hospital really took that to heart, that they were really concerned about what was the most effective way to provide for the health of the public, not just treating patients, but how could they reach out to people? And they were doing a ton of stuff as outreach that was not, you know, not within their four walls. They were really trying to reach out to people. They were trying to achieve you know, try and get vaccination rates. You know, I'll put it this way: the vaccination rates in the hospital for white employees is 97%. Vaccination rate for people of color in the hospital at one point was 45%. And so and that's in a hospital setting. And when you talk about the health of the public in our area and the people that we serve, and you extrapolate those types of numbers to those areas, it really makes you think about what is the business of the hospital? Are we there to provide services to the people who come to us? Are we there to try and enhance the health of our community? And I think that that's a long-winded way of saying that the issues of diversity, equity, and justice have become embedded in hospital operations and become so important in our, you know, in our compliance world. And I think that's in large part the reaction to kind of what we're seeing through the public health system during the course of the pandemic. So I'm not sure. I got a little off topic there, but I think that the fact that the compliance program is there to enhance the work that we do and make sure that it is compliant, obviously, and that we're doing things legally, but to enhance the work that we're doing and the mission of the hospital became pretty important to me.
Yeah, I don't think I need to nudge you. I think you did both of the questions just great. I think we have, that pretty much ends our, oh, here's one more. I think we've kind of answered this as the one now looking to plan a course load for next semester. What courses do you recommend pursuant to a career in healthcare compliance? Take a look at the, take a look on TWEN. Speaking of dinosaurs, take a look at TWEN and the compliance certificate program. You'll see the courses you should take, or you should take administrative law. I think Rochelle said that. You should take administrative law. You should take Professor Abely's course in compliance. You should take our course in healthcare law, and you should take hospital law. That's my 2 cents. I think that other than that, just some thanks from everyone in the Q&A. Do you have any, let's see. Well, this is interesting. Here's one more question. At what point did you realize the magnitude, this is for both of you, at what point did you realize the magnitude of this pandemic could reach what it has? And have you referenced past legal principles or even historical events for guidance on how to approach and handle compliance issues under your responsibility? The magnitude part's really interesting. Yeah. When did you know we were in it deep? And then what?
Yeah. You want me to go, Rochelle? Or?
I'll take that. It's probably shorter than yours. For me, March 18th, we went home March 13th, and by the 18th, I live in Manhattan, and there were people being wheeled out of the building across the way, and so that's when, for me personally, that hit. And then that's also the week that the markets really started to be volatile. In terms of, sorry, was the rest, how did you know how long it would be, and where did you look in the past?
Well, yeah. Well, to what historical references did you use, whether it's legal or just, factual, as a way of, once you realized how serious it was, did you reach back to any historical references or legal principles? Or
For me, it was definitely historical references and kind of ideas on how to help people manage stress through trauma. So looked at past traumatic events in history and how did those populations, whether it was World War I or World War II, how do you keep people resilient? We talk about business resiliency, which is the ability for your business to continue through a volatile time, but really looking then at how do you support your employees, because a compliance program is only as good as the people in the business and their ability to really continue operating at that high level of work. And so that's what I had to do, is much more of a soft skills personal thing than looking to law.
okay.
Well, I would say that by March of 2020, we were well into the pandemic and knew that it was serious. We were, as I said, we were canceling elective surgeries. We were not admitting patients for any elective procedure that we could avoid. We were people were working incredibly long hours. The setup for ICUs and creating ICUs to cover COVID patients was, in full was full on, and the financial consequences of doing all that, not only not providing the care we normally provide and getting the reimbursement that we would normally get, but on top of that, spending huge sums of money to try and prepare for the pandemic. I mean, we knew right away that this was not done on a lark. This was serious, and we were in it for a long haul. So it became pretty obvious to us in a hospital setting that this was a significant event. In truth, I would say that there's very few things that I look back on to draw on. This was a new endeavor for me and for a lot of the people in the hospital. So there wasn't a lot to draw on. I think to the extent that we had to, in looking at the new laws and regulations and the waivers that we were given, trying to look back at the legislative or legal history to understand what the principle was and preserve the principle at the same time that we were kind of bending the rules or getting latitude, I think was the thing that we would do. But there wasn't a template for us on a lot of this stuff. But again, trying to kind of keep the big picture. What is the government really hoping to do by EMTALA laws, HIPAA laws, and how can we best provide care while keeping those kind of big picture ideas in mind at the same time, is what we did.
I think that's pretty much it for the questions. One thing, and I think you've pretty much both answered it, but I'll give you another shot at it, was just the sort of the takeaway from the world of pandemic and compliance. So when we get back to some degree of normalcy, what do you see still being an issue? That would be something that, and I think, Jim talked about it a bit with telemedicine as an example, and I think Rochelle did as well. But if you have any sort of final comments on that, that would be great. Any more thoughts or?
In finance, it was really the rise of all sorts of new fraudulent schemes. The SEC was putting out alerts. I'm sure y'all are getting those texts about your car warranty expiring, but it's learning in a remote environment how to securely replace things like signatures. So I think we're going to see a lot of new technology come out, a lot more use of blockchain, and a lot of new cybersecurity protocols coming out to prevent fraud.
Which will continue well beyond the end of pandemic. Yeah. Thanks.
Definitely.
Yeah, some of that's similar in the healthcare environment. I would say the major thing we'll have to do is try and, once you give people the latitude to do a lot of things that to provide, in our case, to provide care that they think is appropriate for the patients, trying to reimpose a set of regulations or rules on those people who've had a different way that they've been allowed to work is really difficult. So it's a training exercise, it's an auditing and monitoring exercise, it's a reinforcing exercise, and at the same time we know that the government's going to be out there kind of auditing us. That being said, I think that the pandemic has allowed us to see different ways of doing things. We've moved into a lot of technology fixes in terms of consents and signing of documents as well, different modalities for providing telemedicine and things like that. So I think that those technologic changes are good, and we'll have to deal with them and work with those going forward. So a lot of opportunity in that regard.
Great. Well, I think let's call it a close at this point. I really wanted to thank all of you, Rochelle, Jim, Christine, for making just a great conversation. I wanted to thank Laura, who's sitting there with not showing her face, but behind the New England Law block, Laura Ramsey from our marketing department, who really helped us put this together and deserves a great thanks as well. And so, Christine, any final thoughts?
No, I just wanted to thank our panelists for being here today. Thank you so much for your time. We all really appreciate it.
So thanks so much. We'll see you next time. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Rochelle. Thanks,
Take care, guys.
Thanks, Laura. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.